The diner's faded neon sign flickered outside, casting a warm, golden glow across the quiet street. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the faint scent of fried food, a comforting aroma that usually carried the promise of calm and familiarity. But today the air felt different, tense in ways that only subtle cues could reveal. At a corner booth sat an elderly black man, his posture straight despite the slight stoop of age, his uniform pins catching the light with a quiet dignity. Each pin told a story, a war fought, a medal earned, a sacrifice made. His hands, roughened by years of service, held a chipped coffee cup, and he sipped slowly, savoring the bitter warmth as though it grounded him in a world that often seemed unsteady. Most of the diner's patrons were strangers passing time, the occasional couple chatting softly or a lone worker scrolling through a phone. The hum of the jukebox in the corner played a mellow tune, almost blending into the background, but not quite enough to drown out the raucous laughter from the counter. A group of young men, their jackets hanging loosely, their energy brash and unrefined, were joking loudly, slamming cups on the counter with careless force. They drew a few tired glances from the staff and an irritated sigh from an older woman flipping pancakes at the grill. But the elderly man paid them no attention, his eyes focused on the window and the muted reflections of the world outside. That calm, however, would not last. One of the young men, larger than the rest, with an arrogant smirk and the careless swagger of youth, caught sight of the veteran. A sneer twisted his face as he nudged his friends and whispered something that drew more laughter. Fueled by bravado and perhaps a misguided sense of power, he strode toward the veteran's booth. The veteran glanced up briefly, his eyes steady and composed, meeting the younger man's gaze without a hint of fear, a subtle acknowledgement of the absurdity of the confrontation about to unfold. Without a word, the young man shoved the veteran's shoulder, a careless motion meant to intimidate, and then delivered a sharp slap across the elderly man's face. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet diner, a shocking crack that made patrons wince and look away, unsure whether to intervene or freeze. Some instinctively grabbed their phones, perhaps to record the incident. Others just stared, rooted in disbelief. The veteran's head jolted slightly from the impact, but his expression remained calm, almost unreadable. His hand trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the controlled surge of anger that required decades of discipline to contain. The young man laughed, triumphant in his own mind, oblivious to the weight of history in that quiet corner. He swaggered back to his friends, expecting applause or admiration for his audacity. But the diner had shifted. Conversations faltered, eyes lingered, and the atmosphere thickened with the silent recognition that the balance of power was about to shift in ways nobody could predict. The elderly veteran set down his cup, each movement deliberate, measured, as though the world had slowed for a moment. Around him, time seemed to pause, and the small diner held its breath, waiting to see what would come next. The laughter from the young men at the counter had barely faded when the veteran slowly rose from his booth, his movements deliberate and steady, a quiet power underlying every step. Patrons instinctively shifted in their seats, sensing the weight in the air, the kind of tension that made even the loudest voices falter. The veteran's eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned the diner, taking in every detail, the smirk of the bully, the uneasy shifting of his friends, the scattered mugs and plates left half empty. There was no panic in his gaze, only the calm, controlled awareness of someone who had faced danger, far beyond this small, confined room. Each muscle in his body seemed to hum with contained authority, the kind that could snap forward with a force few could imagine. Outside, a sleek black SUV glided silently to a stop, its polished surface reflecting the diner's flickering neon sign. Inside, a man in his 40s sat upright in the passenger seat, the leather of his tailored jacket creaking slightly as he adjusted the angle of his tablet. His face was calm but intense, every line telling a story of responsibility and vigilance. He scrolled through reports filled with details only a handful of people in the country were allowed to see: threat assessments, encrypted communications, and security briefs. Then his phone buzzed. A single notification flashed on the screen. Dad's in trouble at Miller's Diner. Bully involved. His eyes narrowed slightly, the color of storm clouds, and a quiet, dangerous determination settled over him. Back inside, the veteran had returned to his booth, though his hand hovered near the edge of the table, as if ready to rise again if necessary. His breathing was steady, measured, belying the anger and indignation that simmered beneath the surface. The young bully, still smirking, leaned back against the counter, tossing a casual glance toward the veteran as if daring him to react. But the old man's silence was not weakness. It was strategy, honed over years of combat and survival. He had learned that true power often spoke in restraint. That one measured moment could outweigh 100 impulsive actions. The patrons watched silently, their eyes darting between the two men, sensing that an invisible line had been crossed. Whispers floated across the room, speculative and uncertain. Did he really just slap him? What is he going to do? But the veteran ignored the murmurs, his focus absolute, almost meditative. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, taking in the rhythm of the diner, the clinking of dishes, the soft shuffle of feet, the low hum of the jukebox. In that pause, he became more than an old man wronged. He became a presence of authority that radiated calm strength, the kind that made even the boldest young man hesitate. Meanwhile, outside, the SUV's engine purred quietly as the man inside slid the tablet into a compartment and stepped out, his expression unreadable but his posture unyielding. Every step toward the diner carried a weight of authority, a silent warning that some lines, once crossed, demanded consequences far beyond the understanding of ordinary people. The veteran's son, head of Homeland Security, was now entering the room, and the young bully had no idea that the moment he had thought trivial would soon transform into an encounter that would define the rest of his life. The veteran remained seated, his posture straight and unwavering, yet the energy around him had shifted. The young bully, still perched at the counter, tried to maintain his composure, but the laughter had drained from his eyes, replaced by a flicker of unease he didn't fully understand. The diner had fallen into a quiet, expectant silence. The low hum of the jukebox seemed distant, almost muted, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Every patron felt it, an invisible tension tightening the air, an unspoken recognition that the ordinary afternoon had become extraordinary. The veteran finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate, carrying a weight that cut through the muted chatter. "You know," he began, "I've faced men who thought their strength alone could define them. I've stared down storms, crossed deserts, and walked through fire, and I can tell you something. They all underestimated what was really in front of them." His words were calm, almost conversational, yet each syllable dripped with authority and lived experience. The young man smirked nervously, leaning back slightly, as though dismissing the old man's words as harmless rambling. But the veteran's eyes locked onto his assailant, steady and unyielding, piercing through the bravado like a spotlight. "War isn't about muscles or intimidation," he continued. "It's about understanding, strategy, discipline. And most importantly, it's about knowing your opponent and respecting the consequences of your actions." The young bully's smirk faltered, a twitch of uncertainty crossing his face, though he tried to mask it with forced laughter. The veteran, sensing the hesitation, leaned slightly forward, his hands resting lightly on the table, calm but ready to spring into action if necessary. Patrons shifted subtly in their seats, drawn to the veteran's words, feeling the authority in his voice even if they didn't fully understand its depth. The veteran spoke not just to the young man, but to the room, to anyone who had ever witnessed injustice and stayed silent. "I've seen arrogance destroy men," he said, his tone carrying the weight of decades, of battles fought and lives lost. "And it's not always the strength you can measure with your eyes. It's the courage, the patience, the knowledge of what's coming that wins in the end." The young man laughed awkwardly, attempting to regain control of the situation, but each word from the veteran landed like a precise strike, invisible yet undeniable. Around him, the diner seemed to shrink, the world compressing into a small space where only truth and consequence remained. The veteran's voice grew slightly firmer, more insistent, though never raised. "You think this is just a joke, a moment of fun. But life has a way of teaching lessons to those who think they are untouchable. And some lessons," he added, a subtle edge creeping into his tone, "come with consequences you can't imagine." The young man shifted uneasily, suddenly aware that he had stumbled into a presence far beyond his reckoning. He looked around, noticing for the first time the patron's eyes fixed on him, not with judgment but with quiet awe and fear. The veteran's story was more than words. It was a warning, a prelude, a controlled demonstration of power and experience that the bully had no way of countering. And in that room, for that suspended moment, it became clear, this was no ordinary man, and this was no ordinary confrontation. The diner door swung open with a soft but unmistakable authority. and every head instinctively turned. A man stepped inside, tall and composed, his suit perfectly tailored, his presence commanding the room without a word. Even the flickering neon lights seemed to bend around him, casting long shadows that accentuated the sharpness of his features. Patrons froze mid-motion, forks hovering over plates, cups of coffee paused halfway to mouths. The young bully's confidence wavered instantly, his smirk faltering as he took in the new figure. There was something in the man's gaze, calm, precise, unflinching, that made the room feel smaller, as though all attention and consequence had focused onto a single point. The man's eyes scanned the diner with trained precision, noting every detail, the unevenly spaced tables, the placement of staff behind the counter, the posture of every patron, and finally, the young man who had caused the commotion. His jaw was set, a subtle but dangerous intensity radiating from him. Though silent, he exuded control, the kind of control earned from years of managing threats that few could even comprehend. He moved toward the veteran's booth with measured steps, each one deliberate, almost ritualistic, like a general entering the command post of a battlefield. The young bully's laughter had long since died in his throat, replaced by an anxious twitching of fingers and an awkward shift of weight from one foot to the other. His friends muttered amongst themselves, but their whispers faded, swallowed by the tension emanating from the approaching figure. The veteran looked up, his expression calm, almost serene, and nodded slightly to his son. A silent signal, a recognition of shared understanding. No words were needed. Decades of shared history and respect passed through that single glance. When the man reached the table, he stopped a respectful distance away, his posture impeccable, yet the air between him and the young man seemed electric, charged with an authority that demanded obedience. "You've made a serious mistake," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying the weight of laws, power, and consequence. Each word landed deliberately, like the precise placement of chess pieces on a board, calculated to leave no room for argument, no avenue for defiance. The bully's attempt at bravado dissolved immediately, replaced by nervous stammering, fumbling for excuses that could never match the gravity of the situation. The veteran's son surveyed the room briefly, then locked eyes with the young man again. "Respect is not given freely," he continued, voice unwavering. "It is earned, and when you disrespect those who have served, you invite consequences beyond your understanding." His words were calm, almost conversational, yet every syllable contained a threat so invisible yet so real that the young man's bravado collapsed entirely. Around them, the diner seemed suspended in time, patrons leaning forward subtly, sensing history being quietly written in the corner booth. The veteran sat back slightly, letting his son take the lead, confident that the young man's lesson was about to be delivered. For the first time, the bully realized the truth. He was facing not just an ordinary man, but a family whose honor, courage, and influence extended far beyond the walls of this small, unassuming diner. The young man's panic was silent but absolute, and in that suspended moment the rules of the room had changed forever. The diner slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the tension hung like an invisible fog, lingering in every corner. The young bully, now pale and shaking slightly, was being quietly escorted toward the door by two staff members, their faces tight with a mix of apprehension and resolve. He no longer attempted laughter or bravado. The weight of the confrontation and the authority behind it had stripped him of every pretense. Patrons whispered in low tones, glancing at each other with wide eyes, realizing that what they had witnessed was extraordinary, a private lesson in courage and consequence, delivered with quiet precision. The veteran remained seated, his hands wrapped around the coffee cup, a faint tremor in his fingers that was more from restraint than fear. He watched his son, whose presence had shifted the energy of the room in a way that no one could ignore, and a small, approving smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The two shared a look that needed no words, a silent acknowledgement of the trust and strength that bound them. They had faced different battles in different eras, but both understood the importance of honor, vigilance, and protecting what mattered. As the last of the young man's friends scuttled out the door, muttering excuses and apologies, the diner's atmosphere began to settle. Cups clinked, plates scraped lightly, and the soft hum of the jukebox filled the silence once again. Yet the impact of the confrontation lingered. Patrons returned to their meals more subdued than before, their conversations carrying an undercurrent of awe and respect. Some whispered among themselves, recounting the scene as though it were a legend unfolding in real time. Others simply stared, reflecting on the quiet authority that had transformed an ordinary afternoon into a demonstration of power, patience, and integrity. The veteran's son took a seat across from his father, careful not to draw undue attention, but his presence radiated reassurance. "Are you all right?" he asked, voice low but firm, carrying the weight of both concern and command. The veteran nodded, sipping his coffee slowly, savoring the warmth and the return to calm. "I'm fine," he replied, his tone even, but his eyes gleamed with a quiet pride. Lesson delivered. The two men sat in companionable silence for a few moments, the kind of silence that only exists when words are unnecessary and understanding is complete. Around them, life in the diner resumed its ordinary rhythm, though the memory of the encounter would remain long after the last cup was washed and the last plate cleared. Outside, the city moved oblivious to the storm that had passed within the walls of Miller's diner, unaware that a moment of disrespect had been met with a force both measured and undeniable, a reminder that courage, experience, and authority often run in bloodlines. As they finally stood to leave, the patrons watched discreetly, sensing that they had just witnessed something rare. A father and son united not only by family, but by principles, vigilance, and honor. The veteran's steps were steady, the son's posture commanding yet understated, and together they walked out into the fading afternoon light, leaving behind a diner forever changed, a bully forever chastened, and a quiet but unforgettable story of respect, courage, and the invisible power of family bonds.